to have argued really your first appellate case in the United States Supreme Court is kind of an unusual experience. I actually went to my firm at the time, to the litigators, and I said, well, can I come down and meet with somebody who's argued in the Supreme Court, just so I can get an idea of what it's like? And they said, we have nobody. Most lawyers simply file attempts to get cases before the Supreme Court that are turned down. So very rarely is a case taken. And then nowadays, if a case is taken, you hire these specialists in the Supreme Court. So what I did back in '90 doesn't happen much anymore. A lawyer with a creative client like you that comes up with an idea, and we carry that ball all the way to the US Supreme Court, was unusual. The key thing about that case was that I like to talk about it is it was generated to raise these very issues at the highest level. And you came up with this idea of picking a special election, printing an ad that wasn't very high quality, saying that the chamber wanted to run this, but they were at risk of criminal prosecution, and therefore we were bringing this declaratory ruling. So it was based on real facts, and the court took it, and we were able to raise that next step. And the other thing that's important, if you're going to argue a case in the Supreme Court, you need to know where you fit in a series of cases. Anytime you're dealing with the First Amendment, or these most recent cases dealing with right of privacy, gay marriage, that sort of thing, you need to build on all the cases before that. And that's what you brought and we refined. The series of cases, it began to say there is such a thing as political speech. You can't restrict corporations from participating in ballot campaigns. You couldn't restrict certain other people. And we felt that this was the next step, a big step, to move toward allowing corporations to participate in independent expenditures, partisan on behalf of candidates. Another little story that I'll tell was, during that argument, we met with all of the groups that had filed amicus briefs. And one of them was a group of the feminist groups, National Abortion Rights Action League, National Organization for Women. And I met with them, and they were very nice, and they had their lawyers doing their briefs. And they said, well, we're going to tell you the truth. We have tried to figure out a way for you to lose and us to win. Can we make an argument that we're more entitled to First Amendment rights, even though we're corporations, we're nonprofit corporations? But the Michigan Chamber was a nonprofit. And they said, we really tried, but we couldn't. So we're on your side. The ACLU was on our side. And so to me, that was interesting how these Supreme Court cases and these constitutional principles rarely break down on Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative. And that's the trouble with reading the newspapers, if that's all you read. The press has to polarize everything and then report it only that way. And of course then the people in the system need to do that too. So President Obama attacks the Supreme Court in a State of the Union speech on the Citizens United case. It's a very, very important decision, and the most recent one that just came down, also removing some of the limits. These are really just part of expanding political speech. And I've been involved in it for 50 years. I did an editorial in Papaw High School that they wouldn't publish in my school newspaper. The principal said, we can't publish that. So I just printed it up and I gave it to the teachers, and they handed it around in the faculty room where they would go smoke, because they agreed with me. And some of the other things that we have done over the years. I'm pretty consistent in saying that political speech is something that is kind of at the core of the First Amendment, and if you don't defend everybody's right, we see what happens in all of these other countries where they now are trying to crack down on the internet, they're trying to crack down on the press, and it happens. And then we have some people in this country trying to do the same thing. When they argued the Citizens United case, the Assistant Solicitor General said, they asked him, well, does that mean the way, under your interpretation, they could ban a book that talked about Hillary Clinton before the election? And he said, yes. So the Obama administration is not a particular fan of the First Amendment. And they have a lot of other people. That's why these fights are worth fighting, even if you're not terribly popular sometimes.
Now, you got a memento out of arguing a case before the United States Supreme Court. What did they give you?
Well, they give you a quill pen that I believe I lost. I always had it on my shelf, and I must have, when I moved, it's either in a drawer someplace or I didn't have it framed. If I'd won the case, of course, I would have had a framed picture of the holding and my quill pen, but we didn't win. It took 20 years for the court to issue the three most important words in my professional career. Austin is overruled. And when the court said that, you and I were vindicated. We were just 20 years early.
Well, let's move to another area, and that has to do with John Engler's election as governor. But before we get to John Engler's election as governor, let's go back to when he was still a state senator and as chairman of the campaign committee for Senate Republicans. You and he came up with the concept of the senatorial trust.
Right. We had the same issue of limitations. And therefore, John Engler, then Senator Engler, wanted to have a more coordinated campaign. He was unlike some of his predecessors. The Senate Republicans had been in the minority for years, and they were happy to stay in the minority. They just needed to elect their incumbents. John had a different view. He wanted to take over. So he wanted to raise more money, and they didn't have a real vehicle for it. There were no caucus committees then. Every committee was subject to these limits. So we came up with this model of a senatorial trust, which was similar to the COG. It was a system of committees that could work cooperatively, not unlike the AFL-CIO. I did a study of all the AFL-CIO committees. They're all in the same building, all had the same treasurer. They're all different from a legal point of view. And so we did that. And again, John wanted to win. So he spent some money to support Norm Schenkel in a primary. The kind of thing that you have to do if you're serious about taking control. Because if you have a weak primary opponent, wins the primary, then you have no chance to win. Unfortunately, Bob Vander Laan, the Senate Majority Leader, didn't agree. He was more of the old minority view. We don't spend money in primaries. And he filed a complaint against John Engler and removed him from the Appropriations Committee, which was a huge insult and slap. And John Engler, I remember, and I went and we spent about 8 hours at Beggar's Banquet restaurant, which was kind of a political hangout then, and went through everything he did with the senatorial trust, with the campaign committee. And because I know all the laws, and we kind of went through everything, I figured you didn't do anything wrong. You had the authority, you did what was legally permitted. So I wrote a lengthy letter explaining all that. And that went away. It just went away because—
This was a letter to Vander Laan?
It was not to Vander Laan, to his lawyer.
Okay.
Leo Farhat, prominent Republican who had always picked the judges in Ingham County for Governor Milliken, and a good guy, but and fortunately, Leo read that letter and said, "Oh well, I guess Vander Laan is wrong. There's nothing wrong here." So, a couple things surprised me. One is when John Engler took over as governor, Vander Laan by then was a very prominent lobbyist, and John never held it against him. I would have just made that man's life unpleasant. But John Engler, like so many of the really good politicians, just they forget and they move on because they're heading someplace. And but I did talk to John the night before he was sworn in. I remember sitting, I drove him home because I'd been the transition director, and we were sitting there and it was real cold, it was December 31. And I said, "Well, John, tomorrow you're going to be governor, and I'm going back to practice law," because I wasn't going in the administration. And we just got talking about it. And I remember two things he said in that. he repeated what he has said many times. He said, well, George Romney told me to be bold.